I am a humanist. I'm part of the humanist family. And to all of you who are humanists or are thinking about humanism, I welcome and embrace you. The theme of tonight's talk is LGBT plus rights, what's done and what remains to be done in the future. So I would like to start with the positives. Certainly the LGBT plus community and our straight friends and allies have achieved an enormous positive change in the past few decades. When you think about it, way back in 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-LGBT plus laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Yet by 2013, every single one of those major laws had been repealed. That has got to be the biggest, fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. In just 14 years, all those historic laws were consigned to history. And I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the many thousands of unknown and unsung LGBT plus people, and very importantly, our straight friends and allies. It's only thanks to your efforts that these changes have come about. So we can all, I think, collectively be hugely proud of the reforms that have been won. Going back in history as well, it's probably worth remembering that contrary to the perception, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act did not legalize homosexuality. It did not end criminalization. First of all, it only applied to England and Wales. Secondly, it was not extended to Scotland until 1980 and not to Northern Ireland until 1982. And it did not apply to the armed forces or the merchant navy. Only decriminalized or partly decriminalized there many years later. But even having said that, the 1967 reform was a very partial, limited decriminalization. It was not a legalization. And in the years after 1967, in the 7 years after 1967, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for consenting same-sex offences increased by 400%. A huge, massive increase by police forces around the country who did not accept the partial decriminalization and weighed in even more heavily against our communities. The full decriminalization of male homosexuality only was achieved in England and Wales in 2003. It was only achieved in Northern Ireland in 2009 and only achieved in Scotland in 2013. So you can see it is very, very recent. And it's only from those years that there's been no discrimination in criminal law between same-sex and opposite-sex behavior. I mentioned the huge positive changes from 1999 onwards. The first to go was, of course, the ban on same-sex people in the armed forces. That was a huge battle that was won, not by the initiative of the British Parliament, but as a result of 4 very brave service people who took their case to the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled that Britain's ban on LGBT plus people in the armed forces was unjust, unlawful discrimination. And then that was followed up by another European Court of Human Rights case to equalize the age of consent. The court ruled that, again, that discrimination in the age of consent for gay and bisexual men was unlawful, unjust discrimination. And then, of course, we had many other reforms. The end to the ban on same-sex couples fostering and adopting children. The declaration that discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation and then based on gender identity were illegal. That was only in 2003. Up until that time, it was lawful for an employer to refuse to hire someone or to sack them or to demote them on the basis of their sexuality. Then we also had the enactment of civil partnerships, which came into force in 2005, the first ever legal recognition of same-sex couples. Up until that time, people of the same sex who loved each other and were committed to each other had no legal status in law. We had no recognition and no rights whatsoever. Then in 2007, 2008, we had the new legislation to extend anti-discrimination laws to protect LGBT plus people against discrimination in housing, employment, housing, education, advertising, and so on. In particular, equality and non-discrimination in the provision of goods and services. So shops and professional people could no longer, or tradespeople could no longer discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. Then there were similar adjustments also on the basis of gender identity as well. And then in 2013, finally, same-sex marriage was legalized, and that came into force the following year, 2014. So it is an extraordinary pace of change in a very, very short period of time. So, as I said, we can all be very, very proud of all the people, even the small people who did nothing much but just write a letter to their MP. Every single little bit helped. The cumulative collective effort is how we got those changes. But there are, of course, still battles to fight and win. You can change the law, but you also have to change the culture. And that has, to some extent, changed as well. Back in the late 1980s, more than 2/3 of the British public believed that homosexuality was mostly or always wrong. A few years ago, it was down to about 34%. And then more recently, it's come down to 16%. So that's a big, big change from more than 2/3 to 16%. But it still means that more than 1 in 12 of the British public still believe that homosexuality is always or mostly wrong. In fact, it's getting towards one in 5 of the British public still believing that homosexuality is mostly always wrong. So there are still battles clearly to fight culturally as well. But I just want to take a little break just to look at some of the other key areas of reform that still leave us with challenges in the future. Many of you will know the bid to reform the Gender Recognition Act. It was passed in 2004 as part of the list of reforms that I mentioned. At the time, it was a progressive initiative. It allowed trans people to legally change their gender on their birth certificate, passport, driving license, and so on. But there are lots and lots of hoops and hurdles to go through to achieve that. And ultimately, you had to get medical approval and sanction. So the trans community and allies have been pressing for a reform of the Gender Recognition Act to allow self-declaration by statutory ID, so that a person who is trans would be able to make a statutory declaration, which has a legal status, to declare their true gender identity, and that would be the basis on which they can change their various legal documents. That to me is the right thing to do, because the old system was incredibly bureaucratic and burdensome, and unnecessarily so. Of course, there does have to be some protections to ensure that the concerns of some women are addressed. Some women are concerned about women's safety. They say, well, what about, people who claim to be trans who are not really trans? They could get access to women-only spaces, and they could then use that opportunity to engage in violence or sexual assaults on women. And that concern is entirely understandable, and that has to be addressed. We have to find a way in which that can be addressed, which reconciles the rights of women who are trans with the rights of those who are not trans. And I'm sure that can be done. Women, trans or not, they're all victims of male violence, sexual assaults, domestic violence. They have a common interest in working together to protect each other. And so I think it's very encouraging that many women's organizations have for some years already included trans people within their service centers, with the agreement not only of the staff, but also of other women users. And the number of incidents, there have been a small number, but they've been very, very small. The number of incidents has been insignificant and not a legitimate basis on which to blanketly deny trans woman inclusion. Another issue that we face is the ongoing battle to ban LGBT plus conversion therapy. These are various practices that seek to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, often driven by faith organizations who want to pray the gay away, to conduct exorcisms, to expel trans identity or homosexuality or bisexuality from the person concerned. And the government promised to do this almost 3 years ago, in July 2018. And here we are over 1,000 days later, and still it hasn't happened. What is very worrying is that the Prime Minister has indicated that he is willing to allow religious organizations some leeway so that they can continue to pray and do other religious things to change sexual orientation, if that's what the person wants. Now, that sounds reasonable at one level, because we do have religious freedom in this country, and if a person wants to change their sexual orientation, that would seem perfectly reasonable. The trouble is, most of the people who are victims of these therapies are very vulnerable, and that vulnerability is exploited, particularly by religious organizations who pressure them, and in many instances this results in them acquiescing ostensibly. But I don't think it can be classified as genuine informed consent, because these people are in a position of vulnerability, and that is being taken advantage of. I think it's really important to also remember that these therapies are not effective. They don't actually work. There's been, over the years, so many different examples of people who have gone through these so-called conversion therapies and even initially said that they have been cured of their same-sex attraction or their gender identity. But years later, they have relapsed, and they've admitted in many cases that in fact it was all just an act. They were putting it on because they really sincerely believed and hoped they were cured, but deep down they had their doubts. But they never expressed them because they felt under pressure to confirm that the therapy had worked. So anyway, giving religious people or religious organizations an exemption, to me, that would not be satisfactory. That would still leave people vulnerable to these unethical practices. Another issue we face is compensation for gay and bisexual men who are prosecuted under historic anti-gay laws. It's estimated that from the late 19th century to the end of criminalization, roughly about 100,000 gay and bisexual men were convicted under laws that were discriminatory, laws that did not apply to heterosexual men and women, about 100,000. And it's probable that about 15,000 of them are still alive today. Now, my foundation has been arguing for the last few years that those men should receive some form of compensation for what they endured. And what they endured was things like imprisonment, where not only do they serve a period of incarceration, but often were brutalized and mistreated within prisons, sometimes by other inmates and sometimes even by prison staff. Those who were not imprisoned were hit with swingeing fines, which damaged them financially. But in both cases, it was standard practice in the past for local newspapers to name gay and bisexual men convicted and to give their home addresses. So many of them had attacks upon their homes. Others were attacked themselves personally in the street. A lot of them had mental breakdowns, severe depression, anxiety. Some became alcoholics, others turned to drugs, and a shocking number had suicidal thoughts and even attempted or actually committed suicide. So we are saying that those who are still alive today, they deserve compensation, as has been agreed by the German government, for example. Germany pays an average compensation of 3,000 euros to every man who was convicted. And they've recently extended that even to every man who was investigated, like hauled in by the police and subjected often to humiliating and aggressive interrogations. So there's a precedent in Germany for the kind of legislation and compensation that the British government should pursue. As of the moment, the government has said no. And we say that is not good enough. These men deserve compensation for their suffering. Another issue is the shocking mistreatment of LGBT plus asylum seekers. They flee intensely homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic countries seeking a safe haven. They come here, and often as not, they're put into asylum detention centers, which are basically prisons by another name. They don't have freedom of movement. They don't have the right to access to research materials and so on to prepare their asylum cases. Their freedom is seriously curtailed. Those who are not detained are forced to live in Home Office provided asylum hostels, which are often, by most housing standards, substandard, often overcrowded, often squalid, poor hygiene, poor plumbing, inadequate cleaning and showering facilities. Some are okay, but a lot are very, very, very substandard and would not pass muster. On top of that, all refugees, until they secure refugee status, are forbidden to work. So those in an asylum detention center, they have their food provided for them and obviously their accommodation. Those in hostels, they have their accommodation, but they have to buy their own food, their own transport, their own mobile phone, etc. And they get less than £40 a week to do this. Now, you tell me, who can survive in Britain today on £40 a week for all their food, travel, mobile phone, clothes, cleaning, etc.? It's impossible. So refugees are put in a position of extreme destitution because they cannot work. Not only is this unfair and cruel, it's also stupidly short-sighted, I suppose, is perhaps the worst word. It's stupidly not in the country's economic interests. Why would we want to pay a refugee their accommodation, food, etc., Why would we do that when they could be working, earning money to support themselves, providing their own accommodation, paying tax and national insurance? So we are part of a campaign called Lift the Ban on asylum seekers working. Many of these asylum seekers have skills that Britain needs. My foundation helps hundreds of asylum seekers with a wide range of different countries and experiences. But nearly all of them have skills that we want and need. So doctors, plumbers, teachers, care workers, people that can actually contribute to our economy and make Britain better. So it's complete madness that they should not be allowed to work. Another issue, I mentioned that all the major laws have been repealed, but there are still some minor laws or relatively minor laws where we still don't have full equality. So let's just take the equality laws themselves. We have some great equality laws, and the icing on the cake is, of course, the Equality Act of 2010. But written into all these laws are limited qualified exemptions for religious organizations, not just places of worship, but also schools, hospitals, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless, and so on. In certain limited circumstances, they are allowed to discriminate against LGBT plus people if they can demonstrate that it is necessary their religious ethos. Now, no other institution in society has these exemptions. They are just exclusively for religious bodies. And we say that why should religious organizations be above the law? That is totally wrong. People of faith are entitled to their point of view, but they're not entitled to discriminate. So we want the equality laws amended to remove those religious exemptions. Another question that still challenges us is the scale of bullying and hate crime. The most recent research shows that almost half of all young LGBT plus people experienced bullying at school because of their sexuality or because of their gender identity. This may have been limited to teasing and name calling, but in some cases it involved threats and actual physical violence. Again, no pupil should have to endure that. Schools should be a safe place for everyone. Likewise with hate crime on the street. A third of all LGBT plus people say they have been victims of hate crime. A third. That is a lot of people. And again, it may range from abuse and insults, but includes a lot of actual physical violence. And among older LGBT plus people, many report having been victimized not once in their life, but 2, 3, 4, or 5 times over their lives on account of their sexuality or gender identity. So we really have to do more to tackle bullying in our schools and hate crime on our streets. I would say that there should be a legal obligation on schools to prevent bullying, all bullying, racist bullying, misogynistic bullying, the bullying of disabled people, the bullying of Black and other ethnic minority peoples. It should all be illegal. Not only illegal, but there should be a legal obligation on schools to stop it. And in extreme cases where schools knew about bullying but failed to act, I think individual teachers or headmasters or headmistresses should be held liable and should face jail terms. Some of you may have heard of the horrific case in the United States where a young teenage Black gay kid committed suicide His teachers knew he was being bullied. They knew he had threatened to kill himself, and they did nothing. Now, his parents are suing the school, and I wholly support them. But I think it needs to go much more than that. I think the teachers who failed to act, knowing that he was being bullied and knowing that he was suicidal, they should actually face criminal charges and should be jailed. The final issue I'll just address briefly is relationship and sex education in schools. It was a great victory when we finally persuaded the government to make this education mandatory in every school. At the moment, it's optional, or it's supposed to take place, but there's no rigorous enforcement, no consistent program in every school. But we won that battle. It was due to come into effect last year, but because of the coronavirus pandemic, it's been postponed to next year, or to this year, 2021. That's great, albeit the 1-year delay. But what is somewhat disturbing is that religious organizations, religious schools, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, etc., they will still be allowed to teach about relationship and sex education according to their own values and ideals. So we can imagine that many religious schools will repeat their historic view that same-sex relationships are unnatural, abnormal, sinful, and immoral. So that will completely counter what the government says should be taught. Now, they will have to teach some version of LGBT plus inclusive education, but if they're then allowed to turn around and preach their own particular homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic teachings, that will undermine the part of the curriculum that the government is insisting upon. The other thing that's a big problem is, even to this day, we still don't know exactly what schools will be obliged to teach. It's being left totally open. So some schools will be able to do it probably quite well because there's very highly motivated teachers who are very committed. But a lot of schools will perhaps do one lesson a year and just skate over LGBT issues in a very perfunctory way, but then tick the box to say they've done their legal obligation. So we really need from the government some clear curriculum guidelines about what schools should be teaching about LGBT plus issues. And that does need to be legally mandatory so that the schools cannot opt out of it. So you can see there are still quite a few battles to fight. And that is without even going on to the issue of the global battle for LGBT plus rights, where globally still almost 70 countries still criminalize same-sex relationships, with about 8 having a maximum penalty of life imprisonment, and 10 Muslim majority countries still having the death penalty. Of those countries, 34 are members of the Commonwealth. 34 Commonwealth countries still criminalize same-sex relations, even though they've signed the Commonwealth Charter, which promises that they will respect individual and personal freedom and guarantee equality and non-discrimination. And I'm sad to say that the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, it may have some good intentions, but it is totally and utterly useless. It allows these member states to get away with persecuting their LGBT plus citizens. And not just LGBT plus citizens, but Commonwealth countries on the whole have a very poor record on human rights, full stop. Some have the death penalty. Some have detention without trial. Some muzzle the press. Some restrict the right to protest and the right to strike. So it isn't just about LGBT plus issues. It's about failings across the board. Commonwealth countries, by and large, do not live up to the standards that they have signed up to in the Commonwealth Charter and which they have pledged to uphold. So we have a huge, huge global battle still to win, and that battle will go on, but I fear it's going to be many, many years before lots of people around the world have the dignity, respect, and rights they deserve because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. But we will continue that fight. We won't give up until victory is won. Thank you very much.